First of all, good evening to the Provincial Grand Master and all of our 121 guests who are currently in the Zoom suite. This is certainly a first for many of us to experience the sheer numbers on this platform. As I can see, there's 5 pages of faces, some familiar and some new, and they can only be new friends. We've received interest from all over the world, from the USA, several parts of the USA, from France, Chile, Brazil, India, Australia, South Africa, Bulgaria, Canada, Jamaica, Sweden. And I sincerely hope that many of them have been able to get in this evening, despite their time zones that they're in, which are obviously different to ours. So if you're up in the middle of the night, I can guarantee this is worth your time. Firstly, my name is Nick Barnwell. I'm the chairman of the Porchway Club, which is Derbyshire's Freemasonry's light blues club for young and new Masons. When we say young, that is an all-encompassing age. So that you don't expect to just see 21-year-olds. Tonight, the Porchway Club are extremely proud to offer this talk by Worshipful Brother Johnson, as he explores the origins of Freemasonry in England from medieval times to the 18th century. Niall has written and presented a number of presentations and has become a bit of a Zoom celebrity throughout the province of Derbyshire during the pandemic. We're extremely grateful for him donating his time and extensive knowledge to us this evening, and we hope that you will all enjoy the event unreservedly. The presentation itself is poignant to all of us here this evening, whether you're waiting to become a Mason or have been a member for years. And this is one of the things that joins us together as brethren, the shared beginning. I must just add that there is no information in the presentation that will tarnish the experience of any individual who is waiting to be initiated. So we're not going to ruin any of the surprises. Can I just ask that if you please type in any questions that you may have into the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen, and these will be consolidated by Gavin and put to Niall at the end of the presentation. Okay. On conclusion of the question, the Provincial Grand Master will sum up the evening and then we'll close the event. So without further ado or waffling on my behalf, may I introduce our distinguished guest speaker for this evening, Worshipful Brother Niall Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, may I thank you and your colleagues in the Porchway Club for inviting me to speak to you. You represent the future of Freemasonry, and it's your energy and initiative which will be much needed to help restore our craft when we are released from this terrible pandemic. Before I begin the talk, let me say that there is a good deal of history in it. But then, starting in the 14th century, that's really only to be expected. Sadly, in this country at the moment, there is a curious attempt to alter or deny our history and to debunk historical figures. That is nonsensical and comes from a total ignorance of our past, which made us who we are. I have always believed that if you don't know where you come from, you probably don't know where you are, and you've no chance of knowing where you're going. When we're looking at our forebears and their times, we should always try to see through their eyes and enter their mindset and refrain from making hasty and ill-founded judgments. So, in the beginning, it's hard to know where Masonry comes from, and even when it began. But given the obvious progression through craft Masonry, the Royal Arch and Templar Masonry, I propose to begin my thesis on Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, when the real Templars were brutally suppressed by Philip le Bel, King of France, and Pope Clement V. I shall also confine myself to English Freemasonry, which differs significantly from what is believed to have happened in Scotland and Ireland. England had a new king in 1307, Edward II, who did not immediately join the rest of Europe in persecuting the Templars, and so provided a refuge for those said to have escaped from France. But things changed the following year, when he married Philip le Bel's daughter, Isabella, and was no doubt called into line by his new father-in-law. Edward was not a good king, spending too much time with his favourite, Piers Gaveston, and in 1314 losing what should have been an away win at Bannockburn, where many believe Robert the Bruce was assisted by displaced Templars. Isabella, meanwhile, found solace in the arms of Mortimer and encouraged the barons to execute Gaveston. Things finally came to a head in 1327, when Edward suffered an unspeakable death and was succeeded by his son, Edward III, aged just 14, and the country was run by Isabella and Mortimer. This changed in 1330, when the 17-year-old king trapped Mortimer in Nottingham and executed him. Edward had married Philippa of Hainault in 1328, and their first child, Edward the Black Prince, was born in 1330, the first of 12 children. Edward III was everything his father had not been, successful in most things and well liked. His son, the Black Prince, the victor of Crecy and Poitiers, would no doubt also have made an excellent king had he not died the year before his father, after suffering for 10 years from a type of dysentery contracted during a campaign in Spain. Edward's death in 1377 brought great change, and the kingdom was once again in the hands of a boy king, the 10-year-old Richard II, the son of the Black Prince. Could I have the first slide, please, at this point? Shakespeare fixed for us a definitive picture of the unhappy king, the second English king that century to be deposed. What he doesn't tell us is how the 14-year-old monarch almost single-handedly and brutally put down the peasants' revolt. He doesn't tell us about Richard's self-obsession, a character trait graphically illustrated in the Wilton diptych, where even the angels wear his emblem. This slide shows the Wilton diptych, which was made for Richard in 1395. On the left-hand side, you can see Richard kneeling, and behind him, on the right, holding a lamb, is St. John the Baptist. And then there are two kings, ex-kings of England, but both of them made saints. One is St. Edward and the other is St. Edmund. And on the other side, you have the Virgin Mary holding the child Christ. And she is surrounded by angels. And if you look at the angels, you will see on the left shoulder of each of them a white heart. The white heart was Richard's emblem. This diptych is really quite small. It's used to be put on a table or a desk, and the king would use that to say prayers and to have Holy Communion. Well, the usurper, Henry Bolingbroke, had himself crowned Henry IV whilst Richard was still alive. And being only too well aware of the divine right of kings, was careful not to kill Richard, but to let him die of starvation and dehydration in Pontefract Castle. Strangely, there are still tangible memoirs of Richard throughout the land, for every pub named the White Hart bears his emblem and is named for him. Thank you for that slide. That can go. Well, I spent time looking at this period of history because what happens in Freemasonry so often relates closely to what is going on in the country and the world at large. And it's at the end of the 14th century that we see the first recognizable documents relating to the craft. We should remember that England was ruled by Plantagenets, who still considered themselves Normans and ruled more than half of France as well. We must also remember the power of the Pope, under whose authority monarchs throughout Europe held their realms. But it was also the time, in 1348, of the Black Death, which reduced the population of England from about 6 million to 2 million, and continued to resurface throughout the century. The language was changing as Norman French and Anglo-Saxon began to meld and became the language we know as Middle English, Parliament first using it in 1362. Despite the start of the 100 Years' War in 1337, cathedral building continued at the hands of itinerant master masons, whose earning power and tax-free status made them amongst the richest men in Europe, and to whom we are indebted for much of our speculative Masonic ritual and organization. Can I have the next slide, please? But perhaps the greatest and farthest reaching development of the century was the refusal by many scholars, led by John Wycliffe, to continue to accept without question the beliefs and doctrines of the Catholic Church, and who sought major reforms. It was Wycliffe who first translated the Bible into English. And when the Lollards, as they were known, were outlawed in the early years of the 15th century, possession of a copy of an English Bible became a capital offense. If you look at this particular slide and you look about 2/3 of the way down the page, there is a large capital I. You might be able to make out what comes after that. It is, of course, in Middle English. And if you think how big the Bible is, the task of translating that entire Bible and then having to copy it out by hand because printing was still a couple of 100 years away, it is an incredible achievement. So it was Wycliffe who wrote those words at the beginning of the Gospel according to St. John. And that is where that letter I starts. And if you follow that, you hear it, because I'm going to read what it says. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was at God, and God was the Word." That single simple sentence is perhaps the greatest statement ever made. It was and always should be the foundation of Freemasonry and all that we believe and do. And most of our Bibles, when they are opened, should be opened at that page. Thank you very much for the slide. The earliest written evidence of Masonry in English dates from around 1390 to 1400. It's a lengthy poem in Middle English, created probably by a priest in the West Country. It's known as the Regius poem, or the Halliwell manuscript, and is probably based on a much older work, since the author says in the fourth article, line 143, "By old time written, I find." Its Latin title, translated, is "Here begin the constitutions of the art of geometry, according to Euclid." Before I go on, I would say I'm always trying to persuade people to read the Regius poem. You can Google it, and it will come up in Middle English, which is great fun to read. I quite enjoy reading Middle English. But at the side of it, all the way down, there is an modern English translation. If you do download it, make sure you've got plenty of paper in your printer, because I think it runs to about 17 pages. But it's a splendid, splendid piece of work. So it's the art of geometry according to Euclid. Since all past masters of lodgers wear on their jewel Euclid's proposition 47, probably better known to us as Pythagoras' theorem, we can see here the basic elements of operative and speculative masonry beginning to come together. The poem consists of 15 articles for the master relating to moral behavior and the work on a building site, followed by 15 similar points for craftsmen. Then there is a legend of the 4 crowned ones and comment about King Athelstan, the 10th century king of England. Excuse me. It is not difficult to see, given the references in the poem, why many would-be Masonic historians have allowed themselves to be seduced into thinking that Masonry has a much earlier origin in the Middle East. Clearly, our modern Freemasonry originated in the 18th century, brought about by the combination of various social, political, intellectual, and religious events, although the form it took owed much to what went before. The clues in the Regius poem suggest that it may well have had a predecessor, written in Anglo-Saxon, or possibly Latin, in the early part of the 11th century, and that, together with the growing organization into lodges of the many masons employed in the construction of cathedrals throughout the country following the Norman conquest, was instrumental in the creation of this curious geometrical and moral tone. Prior to the Regius poem, all official references to Masons are in Latin or Norman French. Sculptoris Lapidum Liberorum, London, 1212, Magister Latomus Liberarum Petrarum, Oxford in 1391. And Maistre Maçon de Franche-Pierre, Statute of Labourers, 1351. I've referred to the wealth of Master Masons, and it's interesting to see just how that status was achieved. An English Master Mason would have left home at the age of 9 or 10, already fluent in English and French. Until he was 14, he would be taught Latin in a monastery or be a page in a knightly household. Between 14 and 17, he would learn the basic skills of choosing, shaping, and combining stone. And from 17 to 21, he was required to learn by heart theorems or problems in geometry. For the next 3 years, he would work as a journeyman and be required to submit a masterwork dealing with a set problem of construction or design. And finally, after 15 years, he was qualified, but still had to establish himself in his career before he could become the master mason of a major project. However, once there, he would become rich and respected and would dine at his client's high table. Medieval masons were organized in either lodges or guilds. Lodges were simply workshops on the building site. Guilds were analogous with merchant guilds. And in 1356, the Mason Company of the City of London, which still flourishes, was established to regulate and maintain standards. Most Masons would, however, not belong to it simply because they were itinerant and not working in London. This and other guilds are interesting because on Saints' Days at Christmas and Easter, they would parade through the town and enact mystery plays relating to their trades. There is a suggestion that the modern third-degree ceremony enactment of the death of Hiram of Biff may well be essentially the lost mystery play of a Mason's guild. Sorry, I don't believe it. That particular enactment did not come into being for about another 300 or 400 years. Some 50 years after the Regis poem was written, a manuscript known as the Matthew Cook manuscript came into being. Itself probably a copy of an earlier work. And it was used by James Anderson when he produced the Book of Constitutions in 1723. It's a fascinating document, repeating much of what is in the Regis poem, but also tracing the 7 liberal arts from the children of Lamech to Athelstan. Given these 2 manuscripts, and I should, by the way, say that you can also download the Cook manuscript as well, and you get it in the same way. You get half of it in Middle English and the translation at the side. So again, worth having a look at because it differs slightly. I personally think it's a little bit repetitive, but it's still worth looking at. So, as it says here, given the 2 manuscripts and the frequent appearance of words and phrases used in our present day rituals, it's tempting to think that the Masonry as we know it existed 600 years ago. But that is to delude ourselves. The Masons for whom these works were created were operative Masons, who, by virtue of their being itinerant, formed lodges where they worked. The knowledge they possessed, in particular geometry, which enabled them to erect magnificent stone buildings, was secret and closely guarded. Hence, passwords and a hierarchy from apprentice to master mason. The assumption of an apparently privileged status enjoyed by Masons seems to have provoked the same reaction in the 15th century that we get today. And in 1425, a statute was passed banning assemblies of Masons. It seems likely that the Cook manuscript was in part a justification of the high wages paid to Masons and a petition for more money, arguing that their profession had long been patronized by kings and their assemblies had royal approval. We read that, and I quote, "This same King Charles," that's Charles II of France, "was a Mason. He loved Masons and cherished them, and after that was a worthy king in England that was called Athelstan, and his youngest son loved well the science of geometry. And he became a Mason himself, and ordained that they should have reasonable pay, and should make an assembly, as it is written and taught in the book of our charges." Well, the latter half of the 15th century saw a sea change in Europe. In 1453 came the fall of Constantinople and the beginning of the Renaissance. The center of Christendom moved to Rome, and the rule of the Medici family in Florence encouraged an unparalleled explosion of endeavor in ideas, the arts, and literature. Classical Greek was rediscovered, and manuscripts unread for centuries spurred on the desire to throw off the shackles of religion and superstition and seek man's place in the universal scheme of things. This was a genuine rebirth, which had cataclysmic results. In 1513, Niccolo Machiavelli produced Il Principe, The Prince, a handbook on governance. And in 1517, Martin Luther announced his 95 Theses, challenging the corruption and practices of the Catholic Church, and brought about Protestantism. Little wonder, then, that we can find few references to Masonry. The 16th century saw great changes in England. The feudal system had ended, the language had evolved into Middle English, the Reformation had ended the domination of the Pope and produced the English Church. A new merchant class had arisen. The advent of printing, albeit later than in Europe, had facilitated the dissemination of ideas. The discovery of the New World in 1492 provided fresh challenges and extended horizons. Alchemy very slowly started to give way to natural science, and schools were founded. And under Elizabeth, literature, art, and music flourished in a new golden age. But the age of castle and cathedral building was at an end, and houses and palaces took their place in new styles imported from France and Italy. One Masonic manuscript, called the Dowland, appeared that century in 1550, but is now lost. It is believed to have repeated much that went before in the Cook manuscript, but with two innovations: an oath sworn to the old charges on a sacred book, and the mention of York as a Mason centre. There's also another manuscript known as Grand Lodge I, since it was purchased by Grand Lodge in 1839 for £25. It's dated 1583, but seems to be a copy of an original similar to Dowland, but up to a century older. But it's only in the earlier part of the 17th century that we begin to trace the threads that lead 100 years later to the organization of speculative masonry as we know it. And for the first time, we have a name. The name is that of Ben Jonson, second only to Shakespeare as a great English playwright. Sadly, whilst there is evidence throughout his work of a knowledge of what is recognizably Freemasonry, there is never any evidence that he was himself a Freemason. Born in Westminster in 1572, his father died a month after his birth, and his mother married one Robert Brett, a builder, soon afterwards. Johnson was educated at Westminster School and was then employed in his stepfather's business, at that time engaged on the new buildings for Lincoln's Inn. Johnson soon left, joined the army, and fought for 3 years in the Netherlands against the Spanish. His first play, Every Man in His Humour, written whilst he was probably again laying bricks, was performed in 1598, with Shakespeare, one of the actors. In that same year, he appeared in court when he killed a fellow actor in a duel. What is of interest is that in the court record, he's referred to as citizen and bricklayer of London. In fact, he'd become a member of the Worshipful Company of Tilers and Bricklayers, which still exists. And the quarterage book of that company records that he made payments to it from 1595 until 1611. A cursory acquaintance with London livery companies will show that in many respects their organization is not far removed from Freemasonry. And it may well be that what can be taken for Masonic references in Johnson's work are in fact derived from his membership of the Tilers and Bricklayers Company, of which his stepfather was master in 1609. The following year, 1610, Johnson's play The Alchemist was staged at the Globe. In it, there is a representation of an initiation ceremony with purification of the senses, actions repeated 3 times, entry money paid, blindfolding, a question and answer catechism, the contrast between light and dark, and the removal of all metallic substances from the candidate. There is even a passage tracing the origins of the craft, which might have been lifted from one of the manuscripts referred to earlier. But none of this is incontrovertible proof of Johnson as a Mason. In around 1611, Johnson and a group of talented and influential men formed a drinking society called the Fraternity of Cyrenaical Gentlemen, after the Mermaid Tavern, or Ordinary, where they met. It included John Donne, metaphysical poet and priest, and Inigo Jones, the architect and set designer. A popular form of courtly entertainment in the 17th century was the masque, a short, often sycophantic entertainment with exotic texts, music, dancing. Johnson and Jones combined their talents to produce masques for presentation to King Charles I, but they fell out with each other. 1633, Johnson produced The King's Entertainment at Welbeck for the Duke of Newcastle to entertain Charles. And the following year, when the king again visited the Duke, he asked for another similar entertainment. Johnson produced Love's Welcome at Bolsover. Among the characters in the masque is Maul, the Freemason. Even if Johnson was not a Freemason himself, he was certainly aware of the concept. And Inigo Jones, the architect of the banqueting hall in Whitehall and St. Paul's Church in Covent Garden, is cited by the Reverend James Anderson, who published his new Book of Constitutions in 1738, as the Deputy Grand Master of the Masons in the 1630s. Unfortunately, this is suspect for two reasons. Firstly, there could be no Grand Master or Deputy until after the formation of Grand Lodge in 1717. And if, as seems more likely, Jones was a member of the Masons' Company, whilst livery companies have a master and wardens as we do, there is no Grand Master. And another thing that I would add is that Anderson is well known for making up anything that he didn't know. He wrote a number of histories, some of them commissioned, which were absolute gibberish. It's 1646 before we get the first definitive account of an initiation into the craft of Freemasonry as we know it, and the much sought after evidence that Freemasonry already existed in an organized form. The initiate was Elias Ashmole. Born in Lichfield, he lived at Brasenose College, Oxford, but was appointed the King's Commissioner of Excise, first in Lichfield, then in Worcester, where he was also a captain in the Royalist infantry. He records in his diary that at 4:30 p.m. on October the 16th, 1646, slap bang in the middle of the Civil War, he was made a Freemason at Warrington with Colonel Henry Mannering at Corringham in Cheshire. That same year, 1646, was also the year when the Sloane manuscript, another version of the old charges, appeared. Unbelievably, the copyist or author, Edward Sankey, noted in Latin that he had completed the work and dated it, October the 16th, 1646, the very day of Ashmole's initiation. So Ashmole almost certainly took the oath or obligation recorded in the Sloane manuscript, which contains all the elements of the obligations in the 3 degrees of modern Masonry, and in addition relates specifically to operative Masonry. I say Ashmole's obligation was that recorded in the Sloane manuscript, since amongst the names he gives of those present was a Mr. Richard Sankey, believed to be the father of Edward, the Sloane copyist. The final paragraph in that manuscript says, "These charges that we have reversed, and all other that belongeth to Masonry, you shall keep to the uttermost of your knowledge, so help you God, and by the contents of this book." This is just one of the interesting matters relating to Ashmole. Mannering, his fellow initiate, was a colonel in Cromwell's New Modern Army. Yet here, in the middle of the Civil War, just 3 months after the surrender of Worcester, where Ashmole had been tax gatherer, a notable royalist and a successful parliamentarian army officer were together initiated into Freemasonry. In fact, Mannering and Ashmole were related by marriage. Colonel Mannering was the cousin of Ashmole's first wife, Eleanor Mannering, who died in 1641. His second wife, whom he married in 1649, was Mary, Lady Mannering, I don't think any relation, a thrice widowed and wealthy woman. Whilst this may well be the first recorded initiation, there must have been many previous initiations, either in Warrington or elsewhere, since Ashmole lists the names of members of the lodge, including Mr. Richard Penkett, warden. Interesting and apparently conclusive as this appears to be, it is tantalizing in what it doesn't tell us. We don't know whether this was an operative or a speculative lodge, or indeed a mixture of the two, since the names listed by Ashmole are all traceable gentlemen, and the charges, that is the manuscript employed, were applicable to both or either. There's also the proximity of York and the Grand Lodge of All England, claiming to have been established by royal warrant of Athelstan in 926, and possibly to this day still extant. Ashmole himself says nothing more about his Freemasonry until 1682, when he records in his diary that he was summoned to attend a lodge held on March the 11th at Mason's Hall, London. He again lists the names of those present and says that he was the, quote, senior fellow among them. But that may mean only that he'd been a member longer than any others. Since he speaks of the noble dinner afterwards being paid for by the new, that is, accepted Masons, we must assume that it was an initiation. But his use of the word fellow is of interest, since there were only 2 degrees at that time, apprentice and fellowcraft. Yet again, there are more questions than answers. Gould, a very famous and well-known Masonic commentator, suggested some considerable time ago, understandably, given Ashmole's confusing diary entry, that Ashmole is being made a fellowcraft. But that cannot be 35 years after his initiation and is, in his own words, being the senior fellow there. Then there's the problem of the Masons' Hall, London. Unless this was a building owned by the Masons Company and borrowed from it, as Gould believed to be the case, there was no recorded Freemasons' Hall until 1769. But because they went after the ceremony to dine at the Half Moon Tavern in Cheapside, they clearly had not met in a tavern, as was customary for early lodgers. In reality, the silence that followed Ashmole's 1646 initiation may well have much to do with the Civil War. The quotation we all know, "Love the brotherhood, fear God, honour the king," is to be found in the Regis poem. And I quote the 3 little passages from the Regis poem where they appear. "And thy fellows thou love also, for that thy craft will that thou do. That who will know this craft and come to a state, he must love well God and Holy Church our gate, and to his liege lord the king, to be true to him over all thing." I would suggest that those are quite difficult things in the middle of the Civil War. Honour the king. The king lost his head in 1649. And Cromwell's Commonwealth took place of the monarchy. And the final injunction be true to him over all thing, the king, repeated in all later charges, and now sworn to on the old charges at initiation, allied Freemasonry with the Stuart cause, and may well have forced it underground. With the Restoration in 1660 came the foundation of the Royal Society, many of whose founders may well have been Freemasons, and Masonry experienced a new freedom. The initiation of Ashmole tends to overshadow an earlier initiation in England. Now, I did say I wouldn't delve into Scottish Masonry, but this is quite interesting because I'll read it to you first and then I'll tell you why. The earlier initiation in England was that of Sir Robert Morrie, who was initiated into Mary's Chapel Lodge of Edinburgh, near Newcastle, in 1641. This lodge is number 1 on the roll of the Grand Lodge of Scotland and has minutes dating from 1599. Now, I would say 2 things about this. The first one was that Sir Robert Morrie was part of the Scottish Army, which was making its way down England and had got as far as Newcastle at that point. So that King Charles I had got a problem. He got a problem with Cromwell and his model army, but he'd also got a problem with the Scots who were coming to get him as well. Now, this lodge number 1 has minutes dating from 1599. And the reason for that is a very significant year for Masonry generally, but particularly for Scottish Masonry, because it is in that year that the Shaw Statutes were published. Shaw, S-C-H-A-W. What he did was to make it obligatory for lodges to record their meetings, their members, and to keep proper minutes. It took us about 120 years to get to that in England. So the Scots were giving us one hell of a template to live up to. Anyway, it goes on. As I said, I'll just tell you one more thing that always fascinates me, and that is that there is actually theoretically an older lodge which claims to have some sort of records, and that is what's known as the Mother Lodge Kilwinning. Kilwinning is a town in Ayrshire, and it says that it was founded in 1140, and at this particular period it had also designated itself Grand Lodge. In due course it met with the Scottish Grand Lodge and they came to an agreement. Now, the Mother Lodge Kilwinning is still in existence, and it has a very interesting number, which I don't think is repeated anywhere else. It is number 0. Well, whilst this clearly has more to do with Scottish Freemasonry than English, it reinforces the supposition that the lodge structure was well established. Morrie, like Ashmole, was a founder of the Royal Society, and together with Boyle, Wren, Locke, Wilkins, was a member of the so-called Invisible College, out of which the Royal Society had grown. There are other references to the growth of Freemasonry. A satirical broadsheet called Poor Robin's Intelligence, published in 1676, refers to, among others, I quote, "the company of accepted Masons dining at the Flying Bull in Windmill Crown Street." And curiously, just 4 years after Ashmole's 1682 diary entry, Dr. Robert Plott publishes a book called Natural History of Staffordshire, in which he speaks of persons of quality being admitted to the Society of Freemasons, whose history he finds, I quote, "invented and ridiculous." Plott's intention was to make fun of Freemasonry, but he inadvertently left us much valuable information about rituals, initiations, and meetings, as well as an indication of the universal existence of the craft. And by 1714, there were in existence around 100 manuscripts of the old charges. I think that number's now gone up to about 125. By the beginning of the 18th century, a good many societies had been formed, and Freemasonry was just one of them. Several survive to this day. The Royal Society, already mentioned, and the Gentlemen's Society of Spalding, for example. There's Spalding in Lincolnshire. I'm always amazed by this because there are all sorts of interesting people belonged to it. And they travelled from London to Spalding, given that there were no roads worth travelling on at that time. You know, it was a sort of cart drawn by a horse. That was the best way of getting there. But they turned up there all the time for the meetings. And the place they met is still there in the High Street in Spalding, and the meetings are still held. But whereas in the 18th century, they were talking about esoteric things, about religion, about politics, about whatever it may be. Nowadays, I think they probably talk about beekeeping and flower arranging. It's a changed society, but it's still there. All of these societies answered a need occasioned by the great changes in society that had and still were taking place. Everything in science, religion, government, commerce, even geography was open to question, as certain certainties of earlier ages were systematically discounted. Freemasonry provided a congenial talking shop with a mutual moral purpose for the intelligentsia of the day, set within a metaphorical and ancient framework. It would be good to think that in the 300 years that have elapsed since the formal establishment of our order, we have not lost our ability to respond constructively to the changing world we live in, and still retain our adherence to those ancient charges laid down so many centuries ago and carefully nurtured by our predecessors. In the beginning, Mr. Chairman.
Marvellous. Well, that was fascinating. Thank you very much for that, Niall. Obviously, there doesn't seem to have been many questions placed into the chat, so I'm assuming that the individuals may want to pose them verbally to you. So what I'd like to do is to open the floor to any questions for Niall, please. And if you're able to unmute people for that.
Make it easy for me to hear.
Yep, okay, 1 second.
There's one in the chat, Andy.
Okay, this just come through in the chat is from Richard Davis. Are there any books you would recommend on the history of Freemasonry?
I think there's an awful lot of books about, and I don't recommend any particular one. If you want one that goes year by year, excuse me just a minute whilst I pull it out of my bookcase. There is a thing called the Genesis of Freemasonry, and it's it does everything that you would want to know, I think, together with illustrations and so on. It's by a man called David Harrison, who lectures at Liverpool University occasionally. But he goes right the way through, tracing from its roots through a mixture of medieval guilds, alchemy, necromancy, examines the earliest known Freemasons, their obsession with King Solomon's Temple, alchemy, prophecy, and so on, all the way to the Grand Lodge being formed. So that sort of thing is worth looking at. It's published by Lewis Masonic Publishers. So you get hold of that. I don't know how much it is. Forget how much he charged me for it.
Can I answer the question live a bit, please? Charles Black from Glittering Star. Just an opinion. Do you have an opinion on why people like the Segulliers and all went all the way to Spalding to join the Spalding Club there rather than set it up in London? Do you have any theory on that?
I don't. I haven't a clue. I mean, it seems one of the maddest things, doesn't it, of all? But people like John Gay and Pope and so on, you know, all trogged up there to go to a meeting. I just don't understand it.
Seems madness. I've just ordered their correspondence because apparently you can get them online. Apparently, there's a book on their correspondence. But I'm just intrigued why they go all that way and they go just next in London.
I don't know. Well, I don't think there was any obvious one, and I don't think there was a plague in that particular year. I mean, there was a plague in 1665, and there was a fire in the middle of London in 1666, and the king and the parliament and everybody shifted to Oxford usually at that point, but not to Spalding in the middle of the Lincolnshire countryside. It's mad, isn't it?
It is indeed. Thank you.
Sorry, I can't give you a better answer than that.
No, that's fine. I'll keep searching. As we all do.
Niall, there's a question from me, Ian Smethurst, who says, what are your thoughts on the Kirkwall Scroll and its early carbon date for the central section?
Yes, I can tell you that. The chap who had it carbon dated is a man called Andrew Sinclair, who is a lecturer. I don't know if he still is. I don't think he should be, but he's a lecturer at Cambridge. And he discovered the Kirkwall Scroll, which he valued at 2 million quid. And he managed to cut off a little bit of it and take it with him back to Oxford to get it carbon dated. And it came back with a date somewhere in 1600s, I don't know, which is all a piece of nonsense, because what he was doing, and I'll tell you more about him in a minute, what he was doing was trying to persuade, you know, that Freemasonry had been going in its present form for 300 or 400 years. And what actually happened was that in Kirkwall was actually joined by a house painter who came up, I believe, from Aberdeen. And as a gift to his new lodge, he gave them a large floor cloth. And if the paint were analysed on it, you would find that the Masonic symbols painted on it are probably done by the house painter, and they date from, I think, the 18th, late 18th, early 19th century, 18th, I think it was. And Sinclair then went off to Rosslyn, and he came up with another wonderful notion that Rosslyn Chapel, actually, underneath it, there was a crypt, he said, where the Holy Grail was to be found. And he again made all sorts of references. He said a carving over the door into Rosslyn Chapel is a Knight Templar. He's wearing a tunic with a cross on the front, and he's got... again, he'd obviously had too much Da Vinci Code. I just don't know where it comes from. And the other thing he was talking about was that it was modelled on the ground plan of King Solomon's Temple, which is more nonsense, because the Sinclair family, nothing to do with him, these were the Sinclairs, Earls of Orkney. The Sinclair family were not building a replica of Solomon's Temple, they were building a cathedral. And the only bit that they managed to build was the Lady Chapel, that is to say, the eastern end of it, which is what nowadays is known as Rosslyn Chapel. This silly idiot has never bothered to look up anything. He's never bothered to ask people who know questions. And I think it was one of the people looking after Rosslyn at one point said, yes, and in addition to the Holy Grail, if we dig down, we shall almost certainly find the captain and crew of the Mary Celeste. I think that sums it up admirably.
Stan, I think there's a question from Stan before his arm falls off.
I'm sorry.
Well, just let my grandfather clock do its business.
What a lovely chime.
Thank you. I'm guessing, Niall, from what you've just said, mentioned the St. Clair's and Rosslyn Chapel, you're not impressed with Robert Lomas's and Christopher Knight's work, The Hiram Key, Second Messiah, etc.
No.
No. And he is a Freemason, isn't he? Robert
Quite probably, but being a Freemason doesn't stop you from being daft.
I'm offering no opinion. I'm just presuming where you just. But he's also a professor at Bradford University, isn't he?
Bradford University.
Bradford University, yeah.
Yeah, Bradford University has got quite a large Masonic department, I think. They do publish all sorts of things from time to time.
Yeah, I think I knew the answer to the question when the way you mentioned what you said already, that you wouldn't be impressed with their work. I just wanted to confirm that. That's all.
No, not really. No.
No.
It's like all those people who claim to have found Hiram Abiff's skeleton. Yeah.
I don't know.
Niall.
I haven't heard that one.
Have you not?
No.
Well, stick around.
Niall, Stephen Cribb. I'm the one who's writing from Inverness. I'm also a Blue Badge tour guide in Scotland, and I, for my sins, take a lot of Americans to Rosslyn. And I agree entirely with what you've said. The connection with Masonry is the wrong way round. It's Sinclair was Grand Master Mason rather than the other way round. Even the legend told at Rosslyn is wrong, because in the legend, the Master Mason kills the apprentice in a fit of jealousy for the wonderful pillar. Yeah. I mean, it's a stunning building. It's almost as though the guy said, here's loads of money, go and see what you can do. But there is very little that, as a Mason, both English and Scottish, that I would recognise as Masonic. People try very hard to make the connection. The body of Christ and the Ark of the Covenant are buried under there as well.
Oh, as well as the Holy Grail and
Robert the Bruce as well. Yes.
I know where Robert the Bruce is buried. I've been. He's buried in Dunfermline.
No, only his heart.
But just his heart. I'm getting there. Go on. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No.
You're supposed to interrupt me.
I don't think I've been to a pub in Scotland where Robert the Bruce didn't drink at least once.
There's a question from Philip Titterton, who has said, do you have any ideas as to why the 4 lodges from time immemorial would have gathered to form the Premier Grand Lodge?
I don't know why those 4 in particular, but what I would suggest is that I am not at all happy with the meeting of those 4 lodges. The Horn was the most significant of all of them. I'm not happy entirely because the place they're supposed to have met, I think is it the Apple Tree Tavern in Covent Garden, wasn't there at the time. And the lodge, Apple Tree Lodge, doesn't actually get a warrant until 1723, which is considerably later than the 1715-16 meeting. So I am simply happy to accept that there was a meeting, there is a Grand Lodge formed at that point, and I couldn't really care less who was there, who did it, or whatever. I'm perfectly happy to accept that somebody met somewhere, and I simply leave it at that.
Okay.
The Horn Tavern, the Horn Lodge, is rather interesting. It's now the something and Inverness. I get the whole title in a minute. It's a very interesting lodge. I have been there several times. John Beard was good enough to take me when he was master of that lodge, and they are interesting, those four lodges, because of course they have records which are sadly missing from most of the others.
Royal Somerset House and Inverness Lodge.
Royal Somerset House. The Royal Somerset House, I couldn't remember. Yes, Royal Somerset House and Inverness.
Sitting here in Dunfermline at the moment, Niall, just to let you know, Robert the Bruce's body is buried in Dunfermline Abbey.
Yeah.
However, his heart is buried in Melrose Abbey. It was taken from his body and went to the Crusades. So it says actually his body's in Dunfermline, but his heart's in Melrose.
Yeah, thanks for that, Brian. I haven't been to Melrose, as far as I know. I have been to Dunfermline many times and paid due homage there.
Mm-hmm. If you want to go to Melrose, wonderful lodge there, which is lodge number 1 Biz, which is Jim Melrose, is a member of Lodge of Repose, a member there. We have a trip there twice a year to Lodge of Melrose. Very, very interesting.
Really? That's good. We aren't allowed in Scotland, though, at the moment.
Well, we've tried that for a long time, but Nicholas managed to succeed where everybody else failed.
Still going on for a moment.
Thanks, Brian.
Was that your hand up for a question, is it?
No, I think I've touched the wrong button. Don't ignore me.
Not a problem. there is a question from Jeff Adamson, which says, we hear of the ancient and the modern, and also the city of York, which had presidents.
5 minutes.
What it was who else? The city of York.
I've done the talk. It's just questions.
Can you tell me who it was? Apart from I heard about York, but you're asking for precedents. Who were the other people you mentioned? The other.
It says here the ancients and the moderns, and also the city of York, which had presidents.
That's got to be the city of York or the Grand Lodge of York, whatever they call themselves. But it has never been, to the best of my knowledge, part of our Freemasonry. As far as I know, I don't know very much about it at all. I just don't know its history. And when I said that I think it might still be there, that is just something that I've either picked up or heard somewhere, but I don't know that it does exist anymore. Our Grand Lodge obviously started in 1717, and the ancients, as they call themselves, started in 1751, primarily by Irish Masons. And it wasn't until 1813 that the two of them came together, as you know.
Okay.
I can't tell you. I mean, they're obviously much later than whatever was going on in York that I don't know about. I think there are people who do know about it, but I've never really found out.
There's a question from Chaz Black. Obviously, due to your popularity, we're after your opinions a lot. Do you have an opinion on the Graham MS and the Noahite story, or is that for another occasion?
I think that would have to be for another occasion, because otherwise we shall all still be here at midnight. And some of those poor people who've come all the way from South America and Australia will probably be getting quite cross with me. The Noahite thing is rather interesting. Anderson does make comment about that when in 1723, as you know, he opened Freemasonry to anybody who was a good man and true. It didn't matter what nationality, it didn't matter what colour he was, it didn't matter what his religion was. He was eligible to be a Freemason so long as he was a good man and true. And of course, part of the, I don't really want to go into this because I'm going to get into realm where I don't want to go for people who haven't yet taken the third degree. But there is a phrase, I use one phrase, and that is worshipful master improves a slip. And that has to do with Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the three sons of Noah, going to him, to his body, disinterring it and trying to resuscitate him. Yes, but what Anderson said, that something about Noachites, I can never pronounce the word. I don't know. I can't say any more about it, really. I'm bordering on going into things that I don't want to talk about, basically, because, as I say, I might be spoiling things for other people, and I never want to do that.
Yeah, thanks for that. No, I didn't realise the audience. Sorry, I'll ask you another time. I forgot about the audience.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to pitch things so that you don't talk about things you shouldn't be talking about. You understand.
Chris Taylor has his hand up. Would you like to ask your question?
Just very briefly, Niall, Bristol and Bristol workings, they reckon to be back in about the 1560s, 1550s. What are your views on that?
I doubt that it was actually as old as that. The reason that it's different, of course, is that Grand Lodge made certain decrees about what should happen, and the people of Bristol said, go away, get lost, which they did. So Bristol's rituals, even the regalia, is somewhat different from what you find in most of our lodges. I've never been, and it's a great regret. I should like to go to Bristol, and one of these days I might actually manage it. Not only to a crafts ceremony, but to a Royal Arch ceremony there too, which I think will be quite different. It's nice. We have in Derbyshire, of course, managed to preserve some things. If you go to the northwest of Derbyshire, that is to Buxton, Glossop and New Mills, particularly looking at Royal Arch, you will find that the ceremonies in Royal Arch there differ considerably from those in the rest of the province. And Neville Barker Cryer told me ages ago whether Neville, I had lots of time for Neville. I thought he was a lovely man, liked him a lot, liked a lot of the things he said, but he didn't always get it right. But what he said there was that the Oxford ritual made its way from Oxford up to Lancashire, and that what you've got there is the tail end of the Oxford ritual. When it went up there, I don't know, sometime in the late 18th, early 19th century, I suppose. I don't know when the Oxford ritual came out. And of course, you weren't allowed to publish them initially.
I think we've got no more questions on the chat board. Is there any questions from those that are still on the many screens that are in front of us? I think the probably safest option, if you've got a question so you don't get missed, is bring yourself off mute to ask the question. Okay, guessing that's that's no more questions. Can I pass over to yourself, Provincial Grand Master?
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Niall, for a very illuminating and erudite talk, as always, and what we expect from you, and most entertaining and enjoying. I think everyone present has enjoyed themselves, and I hope learned a little bit about the origins of Freemasonry. It always it's interesting that the Scots always seem to have a habit of winning when they should actually lose.
Is Brian still there, as a matter of interest?
He is indeed.
Yeah.
Don't forget the Irish.
No, yes, we'll ignore the Irish at the moment. Yes, but no, it's been a very fascinating talk, and it's interesting to learn and listen to you talking about how things start to develop and move on, and the interesting and very old lodges that we have around about us. It's particularly great to see so many people, so many brethren here to listen to you, Niall, not just from Derbyshire, but from all across the UGLE, and also the two women's orders of Freemasonry, the Honourable Fraternity of Ancient Freemasons and the Order of Women's Freemasonry, and from Canada, Australia, America, South Africa, Botswana. It just shows you how fascinating and engaging and worldly Freemasonry is, that we have all these people coming to listen to you on this particular night. And credit, I think, to the Porchway Club for organising it. I think it's the first usual one they've organised, and have over 100 actually attending and 190 booking in is a fantastic achievement, and I'm very, very proud of you. Talking of Bristol, Niall, I have been down to Bristol several times for their meetings, and that may be something that perhaps the Porchway boys might like to organise, a trip down to Bristol to see some very different workings, both in the craft and the chapter. They have 36 lodges in their province, all meeting in the same building, and their ritual is not printed, it's handwritten. So you borrow somebody's book and you write it out yourself, and it's all handwritten. That's how they learn it, and it is a fantastic ceremony to go and see. So if you want an introduction, if you want to organise something, I'm more than happy to facilitate that. And it's a great delight as well to see both the Deputy and the two Assistant Provincial Grand Masters and my Provincial DC here with us tonight as well. But Niall, your talk, as always, was delivered in your own inimitable style. It was very interesting, and it's just fantastic to think that I suspect you could have gone on for a lot longer, and that there are probably several other talks around that and going on from that as well, because there's so much there that I feel you probably just skipped over very quickly. So perhaps, there are talks to come. And I know that you've been invited to the Robin Wilson Lodge of Research in Nottingham to give a similar talk to them, haven't you?
Yes, I have. They've asked me to give this same one for the simple reason that they have a meeting tonight, and that's why they couldn't be here. I think they booked in, but then couldn't come. I'm happy to. I'm happy to do that, of course.
Yeah. But no, it's been great, and thank you to all of the brethren that attended, and to Gavin, Andy, and Nick for organising it all in the first place and for getting it off the ground. It's been a tremendous. It really has been good. Yeah. I know one or two people have left now. It is getting towards bedtime for some of the older ones.
How old are you?
And tea time for others like me.
Yeah.
And James, who's still at work.
Yes.
But,
Hi, James.
But Niall, thank you very much indeed for a most entertaining and enjoyable evening. Thank you all. Thank you.
Can I echo my thanks from all of the Porchway Club as well, Niall, and to all of those that attended. We will be putting more on in the future. We are also hoping to finally get out and about to come and visit some of the lodges. So hopefully we'll see a few of your faces in person, but thank you for attending this evening.